So, when we start talking about World War II, one of the things that we want to be aware of is that you have totalitarianism that emerges in the late 20s and 30s. And totalitarianism is kind of this idea of total control. It's not democratic. It's very militaristic. But we don't want to confuse fascism and communism. A lot of times those words get thrown around almost as though they're interchangeable, and they are not. They are diametrically opposed to each other. Fascism is a form of government that is very nationalistic, tends to value private enterprise as long as it supports the state and kind of the national identity. Definitely believes in territorial expansion and that sort of thing. And that, sorry, there goes my Yorkshire Terrier. And so that's very much a part of what fascism is all about. Fascism is also very anti-communist, right? Communism tends to be about kind of this party affiliation. They believe in kind of a tightly controlled economy. They're much more interested in influence and those kinds of things. So you can kind of look through this particular slideshow and get a sense for what that, kind of what that looks like. You've got, Germany, Hitler comes to power and very quickly kind of consolidates his influence. But you also have Japan, right? Japan that had been kind of this more, they had, when they get exposed to the United States, they very quickly start to industrialize, and they don't have a lot of natural resources. So one of the things that will happen is Japan will become territorially very aggressive, particularly by the late 20s and 30s. And so you've got these regimes that are focused on control. Now, Stalin and the Soviet Union are a part of this. And really, in part, because you have kind of the disruption after World War II, you're going to have this kind of idea of radicalism, this kind of, like I said, fascism, communism taking hold. And so you just kind of want to be sure that mentally you're kind of connecting the Soviet Union as a type of totalitarian regime. Even though we will be allies during World War II, that is not going to be something, that doesn't change the fact that it's totalitarian. Italy, the origins of fascism. Benito Mussolini comes to power. Now he will be removed from power, at the end of World War II. Germany with Hitler, of course, Hitler's, writes Mein Kampf. And his rise to power is often done throughout kind of this election system, right? So the National Socialist German Workers' Party, they come in, they get control of the Reichstag, and this is what's going to lead to Hitler kind of becoming the Fuhrer, that sort of thing. The Our Time, America's Century, their section on the 1930s does a really good job of describing kind of Hitler's rise to power. Spain has a proxy war between the communists and the fascists, and so you have that taking place. Japan invades China by 1937. You have the rape of Nanking, which we kind of looked at when we talked about genocide. So you have, these powers that are coming in. The Axis begins to form, first Germany and Italy. Then Japan will kind of come in, mostly because they don't like communists. And so they'll become formal allies in 1940, mostly because Germany's getting ready to invade the Soviet Union. And so this is going to be kind of where you have this background of this rise to power. Now, the United States throughout the 1930s is neutral. I've mentioned this before. They blame the World War I for why we had the Great Depression. So there's a lot of pushback against that. So you have those series of neutrality acts that are in place. And Roosevelt kind of, and I've mentioned this before, begins to kind of nudge the United States, beginning with things like the Changing Neutrality Acts, and then the Destroyers for Bases and the Lend-Lease Act and that sort of thing. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a background for World War II. And America is largely going to enter, in part because, and I've mentioned this before, that we are essentially behaving, particularly after 1939, when Britain is at war with Germany. We're going to be doing things to help Britain, and that's going to create some frustration. Of course, the Battle of Dunkirk is a big part of this. FDR running again for a third term in the election of 1940. That's seen as kind of controversial, but most people, with the world kind of seeming to be losing its mind in 1940, people wanted something a little more stable. And FDR begins to really frame the idea of the U.S. as protecting these four freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. This idea that we have this kind of larger agenda, and kind of the beginning of really the U.S. kind of taking this position of defending democracy and defending these great big kind of concepts. You also have the arsenal of democracy. The U.S. is going to help Britain because Britain's out of money. We're going to agree to the hemispheric defense zone with the Atlantic Charter, and the U.S. is going to kind of support that. And between that and the embargo, this is all going to create a lot of frustration, by Japan, or on the part of Japan, against the United States. And that's kind of how the U.S. Is going to end up kind of getting sucked in, because Japan's going to attack Pearl Harbor. And like I said, we've pretty well talked about this, but I wanted to be sure and point out kind of what that looked like, especially because if you look at some of the questions that are related here, why did the U.S. enter the fighting of the First and Second World Wars? And we know the First World War has a lot to do with the Zimmerman telegram and unrestricted submarine warfare, and this notion of defending democracy. Whereas World War II, it's the attack on Pearl Harbor. And again, it's the notion of defending democracy, but you have a slightly different kind of, a much more direct attack with World War II. So it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea for how we get involved in that particular conflict. So you can look through these PowerPoints, you'll read the American YOP, and that will kind of help you make sense of this. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview just to make sure that you're familiar with some of these terms. And that's pretty much it.